Hello, welcome to another video. So this time we're going to look at undistorting real-world footage using Nuke. So why do we need to do this in the first place? Well, when we film any shot with a real-world lens is basically any real-world lens will not film a perfect image. It will film a distorted version of reality. And as compositors and 3D artists who are kind of trying to take 3D CGI and match it with live action, we have to try and cope with this. Now, obviously at the end of the day, if a camera has filmed something and it's distorted it, in our final composite, we want to make all of our elements integrate with that, albeit distorted image, because we want to make our things look like they've been filmed by the same camera at the same time in the same place. Now, this causes problems because 3D applications like Maya and render engines like V-Ray and Arnold and their cameras, they tend to render perfect images. So those images are not distorted. Some of them, like V-Ray's physical camera, does have ways of kind of adding in a bit of lens distortion and things like that, but usually it's better to do it in the composite. So what do we usually do? Well, the normal workflow is to say, right, we'll take our actual footage. So here is just a reference still from the camera. This is when we were measuring the set. And we actually undistort that. So we take any distortion the image has and sort of remove it. We then take those images into, say, Maya or as reference objects. So our background image plane in Maya, we want to be an undistorted version, because when we're trying to line up straight objects in Maya, we want to be lining it up with actually straight lines, and not all of the lines in this that were physically straight in the real world would actually be straight. The lens would have bent some of them slightly. Then we render from our 3D application undistorted footage. Then what we need to do is, before we composite it, we re-distort, or we add distortion onto the 3D CGI and composite it with the original distorted version of the plate. So we kind of start with distorted, we undistort, we work in 3D with undistorted, we render undistorted, but then we add distortion on at the end before compositing with the original distorted images. Now, what kind of distortion do we get? Well, typical lenses tend to exhibit these two common types of distortion. There are others, but the most common are kind of barrel distortion you'll get here. You tend to get that particularly on wide-angle lenses, and pincushion distortion here. You might see that a little bit more on telephoto lenses, though it's by no means exclusive, and some lenses actually exhibit bits of both. As well as other kinds of distortion, but they're probably the two most common kinds you see. And here's just a kind of image here. I think this is from SLR gear or something like that, and you can see that kind of barrel distortion very pronounced there. So if we had to comp in a set extension, someone said, okay, there should be another pillar here in the front, then okay, we can make that in 3D, but we're not going to make it with that kind of distortion on it. So we would render it straight, and then we'd add the distortion on later. So we have to know how to cope with this. So I am in Nuke, and what I've got here is an original distorted image. This was filmed with a 50mm lens, and you're going to tend to find that lenses near 35-50mm typically aren't going to be very heavily distorted. You're going to see more distortion at the extremes, very wide angle, very telephoto lenses. They're far more likely to exhibit more distortion, but everything will have some distortion. So we film that, and then what you really need to do is something like this. For a static shot is to film a lens distortion grid. So this was filmed with the same camera, with the same lens. If it's a zoom lens, it's very important it was filmed with exactly the same focal length as the original shot. In some cases, if you had a zoom and you were zooming during a shot, you might have several lens distortion grids and kind of average them or something like that. But I'm just talking about a shot that had a single focal length used for the whole shot. So this was basically a piece of paper, could be card, and the lines on this are dead straight. So this was just a piece of paper with some dead straight horizontal and vertical lines. Yep. And this was put on a flat surface, very important, on a flat surface, and the camera was positioned to film it pretty much straight on. As you can see, my camera wasn't exactly level when I filmed it, but hey ho, we can deal with that. Now obviously if you filmed it and you kind of have a bit of an issue, it's not bright enough or something, well, you can always do a bit of a grade in Nuke or something like that, you know, make the whole thing a bit brighter if you need to, or, you know, do a color correct and change the contrast, or kind of flip your gamma in here. So basically just to get this so that it's, you know, it's got some nice contrast for you to see and for all the tools to work with. Okay, and you can see this was HD 1080, the lens distortion grid, which match the original one there. Probably the resolution's not so critical, but I probably would want to make sure that my lens distortion grid was filmed with the same aspect ratio. So if you've got a camera and it has lots of different aspect ratios that it could film at, I'd probably want to make sure my lens distortion grid at the very least was with the same aspect ratio, and probably I'd just do it at the same resolution just to make life easy, but it could probably be UHD and it probably would make very little difference. Okay, so I've got my grade. So what I want to do in Nuke then is kind of add a lens distortion node. So I'll just press tab and go into there, type in lens, so it gives me my lens distortion node. Great, so this is going to let me analyze the distortion of this plate. So if I go into my lens distortion node, there's various ways we can analyze lens distortion in Nuke. We can kind of do an analysis of a moving camera image. So if we have a moving camera shot and we don't have a lens distortion grid, we can say to Nuke, okay, analyze this, let's do, I suppose, and turn a little bit of a camera track almost, and kind of try and work out the distortion on that basis. If we were looking at the frame and we knew in our original image here we had some straight lines, we could use this as line analysis by kind of drawing some lines on the shot and then kind of doing it. But usually it's easier if you work with a grid. Now some grids don't look like this. You'll see them with these black and white checkerboards, you know, looking a bit like a drafts board or a chessboard. That's fine. If you've got one of those, you can use that instead. You just need to tell Nuke which kind you're using. This one's a thin line grid, so I'm just making sure I'm using this as a thin line grid. Now, because my grid is not level, I want Nuke to align this grid. Yeah, so it's going to kind of rotate the grid around and kind of do that. So I'm just going to tell it to analyze the grid. Okay, it'll take a second or two to do that. Not much. I'm just going to connect my viewer to the lens distortion node so I can see what's going on here. So I can see, great, so this has now aligned it, fantastic, and it's undistorted the image as well, so it's taken any sort of curved lines and straightened them all out. So it's created an undistorted version of that grid. Fantastic. We can see these grid overlays, so that's a kind of original grids, that's where it was before doing this, and then it's got its undistorted grid overlay as well, so I can see it's looking very different from the original grid. Right? Perfect, so that's exactly what we want. I'll just turn that overlay back to off. Right, so we can then use this to undistort this. Right? So what I want to do is I can either copy and paste this node with all the settings in it, or I could just drag the node over there and connect it to that. I'm actually just going to copy and paste it, so I'm just going to do a edit, copy. We could use the keyboard shortcuts, but edit, paste, and hook that up to there. And then I'm just going to connect my viewer. I can either just drag that viewer connection over onto the node, or obviously I could just select the node and press the 1 key on the keyboard to do the same thing. So here we are, lovely. So that is now an undistorted version. Now this is pretty subtle. Because there's a 50mm lens, there's no massive distortion. But if I look at this node and I temporarily select that node and press D, that will actually turn that lens distortion on and off. So that's the original image and that's the undistorted. Now I can see also what I've forgotten to do is forgotten to turn off align. So over here with this lens distortion, I actually had to align the grid because it was filmed incorrectly at a slight angle. Now if I don't turn that off, when I take that and apply it to this image, it actually does the same. So if I look at this lens distortion 2 here and I go to grid analysis, this align grid is still turned on. I don't want to align the grid, so I'm going to deselect that. So now it undoes that whole rotation thing because I don't need that. So this is it after the undistort. And if I disable it, you'll see it looks very, very similar. Yeah. So that's it with the original distorted, and if I undistort it, it then looks like this. You can see it makes most difference over the sides here. Yeah. And this is with a 50mm lens. So you can see this back wall here and the original one is really quite curved towards the edges. And when it undistorts, it becomes much more of a straight line. Yeah. So, perfect. So that's done the undistort job, but unfortunately Nuke, when it does this, it undistorts the image, but it leaves me with still a sort of 1920 by 1080 HD crop of that, because when it undistorts the image, it almost as if it's kind of stretching and pulling and warping the original image so that it can pull all of these sort of curved shapes into line and nice and straight. But what that actually does is it results in an image that's actually slightly bigger than the original. And we can see here, if I kind of look at these corners here, so this is the corner of the actual image, so it's actually a little bit bigger than I'm seeing here. And if I look at the top corner over here, I'll have a similar thing. So up here, this is actually how big this undistorted image is. And I want to export to Maya an undistorted backplate that's actually the correct resolution, because I need to render in that resolution. So I'm going to need to know exactly what that is, because then when I add my distortion into my rendered CG, that will come back originally to HD 1080 with the comp. So I need to get the resolution I export right here. So how do we do that? Well, what we're actually going to do is add a crop node. So if I just press tab and I start typing crop, then we'll see I want a crop node. And this is slightly odd because the crop node, normally of course with a crop you think of making an image smaller. This is actually going to take a sort of bigger crop. So what I'm going to do in this crop is I actually want to look at this lens distortion node here. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm also, when I'm looking at my crop node here, I can see my project settings are wrong. Yep. So my project settings are obviously somewhat strange. So it's always a good idea in your project settings to set them to some default resolution. So I'm just going to go to Edit Project Settings. So my project settings are Nuke's usual full-size format 2K Super 35. Well, I'm just going to set that to HD 1080 because, hey ho, I'm kind of working more with that resolution. Right. Okay, so in the crop node, by default, it's cropping to my my original project settings. So I'm going to take that to 1920 by 1080 just for the moment. Now, what I actually want to do is input into the crop these values here that have been given to me by the lens distortion. Yeah, so my bottom left should be -39, -21. So I'm actually just going to put those values into here. -39, -21. Yep. So it's actually going to pull the image out to that size. Great. And then the top right is, not surprisingly, I can kind of zoom out a little bit, go over here and look for that top right value. So there, my top right here is actually 1951 by 1100. So I'm going to take that and put that in here, 1951 by 1100. Obviously these values would be totally dependent on the lens distortion grid that you'd used and the kind of undistort that it had given you. So you would have different values for your particular shot. But hey ho, there we go. So we've got this crop, and if I now look at my crop node here, I'm kind of getting in this kind of line now is now fitting this dotted line, but I'm not seeing my footage any bigger than it was originally. So what we actually have to just remember to do is in this crop node property up here, we just want to make sure we've got this reformat selected here. So that will now bang recrop this essentially to this full resolution. Yep. And up the top here we'll have this value, so 1990 by 1121. So that's essentially different from the numbers I was typing into the crop. But if you think when it does that, this cropped image, this bottom left is now 0, 0, and the top was 1951 by 1100. So this resolution here, this at least should match the difference between this minus 39 and 1951. So if you actually found the difference between those two numbers, that should be the 1990, and the minus 21 and 1100, that would obviously be the second one. So it's kind of done the right thing. Now, the only slight alteration I want to make to this is that when this undistort actually happens, as I said, it's kind of pulling and stretching the original image around. And I'd expect this not to look like a perfect square image, because it would have slightly pulled the corners different from the others and sort of left gaps. Now, what Nuke does with this crop here, and you can see it if you zoom in a little bit. If I look down at the bottom here, I've got these very odd sort of like stretched pixels. And what Nuke's actually doing down here is it's just taking these sort of bottom pixels here, and where there's no pixel data, it's just like copying that pixel value right down to the bottom. So this stuff down here at the bottom, there's no real image actual data here. It's just sort of copying in some values, and the same will be true at the top and sides to a lesser extent. This will be more dramatic with a non-50mm lens. So what I'm going to do is add another node, a black outside node. So again, I'm just going to type in black. It's going to be black outside as default, and I'm just going to hook that in and hook that up before my lens distort there. Bang. And you can see what that's doing is it's just enabling Nuke to say, okay, well, there was no real image data, just put black pixels. So I can see that it's now just got actual pixels there, and you can see very subtly the same is true on the right and left of the image. So this is where, as a result of all that kind of pulling around of the original image, it's just been left with no real data to put in there. So this is great now. So this is now a undistorted image in Nuke, so ready to go into Maya. So what I would do is just create a right node. So just press tab again, create a right node, and hook that up to my crop. Perfect. So if this is going out into Maya or something like that, I might want to save this Nuke project. So I'll save this comp. Now if I was using my pipeline folders that I've been using here, I would save this into my project, and I would save this into scene 1, and I would save it into shot 1, and this is obviously a comp, and this is a Nuke script, so I'd save it in the script, and then I might save this as lab. I'm saving this as lab 3010 scene 1 010 shot 1, and then I might call this undistort underscore V01, something like that. And I'd also have my initials in undistort SMC underscore V01. Perfect. So that's my Nuke project saved. So if I need to get back to here, I've got a copy of that. So the right node, these images, these undistorted images, I'm only going to use them as a background to my image plane in Maya. So they don't need to be particularly high quality. So I could kind of go into my same project folder and say, right, this is an undistort. Let's say for example this was for shot 2, so I'm going to go to scene 1, I'm going to go to shot 2 for this then, and I would go into my live action and I would save this in my undistort. So my master footage would be in footage, and this would go in undistort, and I would call this something like, say, lab 3 scene 1 shot 2, and this is undistort. I just need to distort underscore. Now in Nuke this is pretty important, because I want to save this out as a sequence of images. I'm going to want each image to have its own frame number, and I need to use a hash key in place of each frame number here. So depending on what keyboard you're on, a PC or a Mac, I think on the Mac it's often Alt 3 or Shift 3 depending on the keyboard you've got selected to get your hash character. But so my frame 1 is then going to be underscore 0001, frame 2 will be 0002, etc. And the number of hashes just corresponds to the kind of number that I've got there. Fantastic. So and then I'm going to want this to be a JPEG file, so I'm just going to give it a .jpg extension and click save. So because I've given it the right extension, Nuke's picked up this a JPEG file. I could lower the quality if I wanted to. I'm probably not super worried about for this one. Just check the right channels. Yep, so RGB channels, quality is looking good. And what frame numbers am I dealing with here? Well, I think in fact this is just a still, but let's say this was a few hundred frames. This would render out a few hundred frames of stills into the right folder. So this one's just going to render out a single image, but if you had 1,000 or 2,000, it would just render out all those frames and it would have undistorted all of them, and you'd then have an image sequence that you could use in Maya as a backplate. Okay, so that's fine. So just remember to keep this, because later on when you want to add a distortion onto your 3D images, we're going to need to use this basic setup and do a little bit of modification with it. So it will come in handy later, so make sure you save a copy of it. Okay, well that's enough for now, so thanks for watching.